When I founded Terran, it was because I was frustrated at the treatment options available for patients with psychiatric and neurological disorders. I had a number of friends and family members with severe mental illness. I wanted to find treatments. During my years of medical training is when I realized that the treatments we have, there's not that many new ones coming out. These research discoveries that are being found in the laboratory are not being translated into the clinic.
All right, welcome to another episode of Life Sciences 360. My guest today is Dr. Sam Clark. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Terran Biosciences. It's a company that's really doing a lot of interesting things in the psychedelic therapeutic space. So let's dive in and have a chat with Sam. Welcome to the show, Sam.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, let's get right into it. You were in the dorm room at your university and you invested $10,000 in the seed round into this company. What was going on in your mind if you were to reflect back in that point of time?
Well, when I founded Terran, it was because I was frustrated at the treatment options available for patients with severe psychiatric and neurological disorders. The issue was that, growing up, I had a number of friends and family members with severe mental illness, specifically bipolar disorder. And also my grandmother died from Alzheimer's disease. And so that's why I went, when I did my undergraduate degree, it was in neuro. I wanted to find treatments. So I went to Columbia to do the MD PhD program. But during my years of medical training is when I realized that the treatments we have, there's not that many new ones coming out. And I could see they weren't good growing up, but at Columbia, I was like, look, there's just no good ones coming out either. There's not much. The pace of development is exceedingly slow. And same thing for the other career option would have been to go into research. But I said, look, most of these research discoveries that are being found in the laboratory are not being translated into the clinic. And so I didn't have high hopes for research being translated in the clinic that way. Nor did I want to go just practice medicine with the existing therapies. So I said, look, I want to found a company that could address this. And I decided to found it a bit differently. I said, I've been looking at a lot of biotechs, and based on the way they're organized with the more hierarchical structure, I feel like that contributes to why they move so slowly, and it interferes with the pace of development. And so I founded Terran, structured as a tech company, based on seeing tech companies in Silicon Valley move very quickly, pivot fast, and make big breakthroughs. So I said, we're going to found a biotech that does this. And that's the structure of Terran, a fast, small team of operators where we bring on world experts to solve critical problems that other people have previously thought impossible.
So it sounds like you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you are, like you said, you are a biotech company, but you also have a proprietary AI-driven platform that you use for drug development. Is that accurate?
We use AI in imaging, in one of our imaging programs, but for drug development, it's actually a number of different things that we do to get drug development done. Yeah.
Okay. And you said that, when you were in school or university, you did this assessment and found that there was not much research going on. Now that you are, in this position, you started the company. When you look back, do you know any reasons why there wasn't much research in this space?
So to clarify, I think there was a lot of research going on into the mechanisms of disease. And the problem is the research is translated into actual therapies very slowly. So it's the slow pace that therapies are developed that hit the market. So for example, when I was at MIT, I was reading about all these possible mechanisms for bipolar disorder, how it might work, and a number of other conditions. And then when I went to Columbia, I wanted to research psychiatric conditions, and I was doing some research into schizophrenia as well. But then, apart from this rich body of different theories and ideas and research, those weren't really testing new drugs. It was more about how the disease might work. And there were ideas about new drugs. But then when I got into the clinic, And I saw that, in my psychiatric rotations, we're using the same meds that we really been using with the same mechanism for the last 40 years. New drugs that were just coming out around that time were really just kind of redusting off the same mechanism, with a little bit of an improvement here or there. It's like imagine a really old operating system, and you get a little patch, and they're patching it and like updating it a little bit, but there's no transformational paradigm. And I said, we need to get in there and develop like the ideas and theories and into new transformational treatments that are completely different and really apply the most modern technology to this problem. And I was looking at a number of other biotechs working in the space, and I was just frustrated at the pace that it would move so slowly. So I said, you want to found a company, get in there, make that difference, help those people with neurological and psychiatric conditions, but do it in a way that we can move much faster than is typically done in biotech.
Got it. That's very interesting. Quick message for the audience before we go into other questions and ask Sam about the pipeline and all of the projects that he's working on. If you enjoy these kind of conversations with other executives, from different biotech and life science companies, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and also our podcast on Apple and Spotify. It lets us know that you like this content, and it also, makes the guest more interested in coming on to our show and sharing what they're doing. So back to the show, we will talk about, tell us about your pipeline in the company. Like what are the different types of products, and what's like the one promising factor for each of them?
Sure. So we have a couple of later stage assets for psychotic disorders, and we'll go through them one at a time. Our lead asset right now is a combination of two prodrugs. These are prodrugs we've created. And before I explain what it is, I better give a quick explanation of what a prodrug is. So prodrug is when you take a compound that is active and highly effective, but you realize that compound has what's called pharmacokinetic problems or limitations. And what that means is you may have a highly active, very good compound for treating a disease, but it's not absorbed well into the body, or it doesn't, it's not in such a form that you can really turn it into a long-acting form of the drug. So when you make a prodrug, you take that active ingredient, that active molecule, and you attach a little side chain to the side of it. And when it gets in the body, that side chain is removed, allowing the active compound that we already know is good to work. That is also good because not only have you improved the molecule to make longer acting forms that are easier for patients to take, but because it's a prodrug, it's often eligible for the FDA's 505(b)(2) accelerated pathway, which allows reference of existing data 5 years after an approval, which means if this original molecule, which may not be optimized, is approved, you can go to the FDA with your prodrug, and they'll let you reference the original molecule's phase 3 data and safety to get yours approved very quickly 5 years after the first approval of the first molecule.
Interesting.
So that now with that summary of why prodrugs are good, one of our lead assets now is a prodrug of a compound called xanomeline and a prodrug of a compound called trospium. Now, xanomeline and trospium as a combination have been shown to be highly effective for the treatment of schizophrenia, and they may be effective in other psychotic disorders as well. It's one of the first new mechanisms to treat the psychosis as an antipsychotic in over 50 years. It's a true mechanism targeting the muscarinic receptors. That older combination, there's a combination of old non-prodrug forms of xanomeline and trospium currently under FDA review, and it's expected to be approved this year. If that is approved, we are planning to put our prodrug form called TerXT forwards and hopefully get that via the 505(b)(2) approved on the market. Now, let me explain how that works. The old prodrug form of xanomeline, xanomeline was invented in 1992 and trospium was invented in 1960. So there's a lot of room for modern pharmacological improvement. So what Terran did is we realized that the current version for FDA up under FDA review is an oral twice daily drug. You have to take it twice a day. So we said we will build prodrugs of this. As we looked at many of the antipsychotic, the big breakthrough antipsychotics on the market, and many of them have already been turned into prodrugs. Abilify, one of the highest grossing antipsychotics, was turned into a long-acting prodrug. Invega, Sustaina, Maintena, Trinza, and Hafiera, those are all turned into long-acting prodrugs. So we said, let's make longer-acting prodrugs of xanomeline and trospium, and then we'll formulate them into a once daily oral pill, and we'll make a long-acting injectable form as well. That's our plan. And then plan to use the FDA's 505(b)(2) path after the original twice daily oral non-prodrug form gets approved, hopefully later this year. So that's our lead asset, and we're very excited. It's called TerraXT, which stands for Terran, Xanomeline, Trospium. And then we also have, another antipsychotic that we acquired in an exclusive licensing deal from Pierre Fabre in France. And this was a compound that had been under development in the 90s as an add-on to antipsychotics. It was a new mechanism, a selective alpha-2 antagonist, and no drug to date has ever been approved with that selective mechanism. So there's currently no FDA selective alpha-2 antagonists on the market. In the 90s, they showed that when added to a patient's baseline antipsychotic regimen, you could have an improvement on top of the baseline treatment that almost doubled the original treatment. Unfortunately, the drug had a very short half-life and had to be given 3 times a day. And so they couldn't figure out how to fix it, and development was discontinued. We licensed it and successfully built a once daily form of the drug. And now we put it back in the clinic in over 100 healthy volunteers to show the FDA that we have the once daily form now of the drug. And then we plan to take that into trials with schizophrenia, where we hope it could be the first antipsychotic booster, adjunctive therapy to improve on baseline treatments. Okay. And then finally, our third main asset is a psychedelic where we've removed the hallucinations. And the idea there is that scientists have shown that psychedelics, as we've seen in clinical trials, can be highly effective for a variety of conditions. Antidepressant, they can be great for anxiety, PTSD. But one of the problems is that they have those long trips. And in many cases, it's about an 6 to 8 hour time commitment, and a doctor has to be present the whole time. This has been estimated to potentially cost tens of thousands per treatment session if this is rolled out in its current form later for example, psilocybin for depression or LSD for anxiety. But scientists also showed that psychedelics, while they hit a lot of receptors in the brain, only one is responsible for the trip, and that's the serotonin 2A receptor. So they said, what if we block selectively just the serotonin 2A receptor, but allow the psychedelic to hit all the other receptors? Animal models showed that maintained efficacy, and then we did a human MRI analysis study that showed that when you do that, there's no trip, but you maintain what we believe to be the mechanism of action of the psychedelic. The functional network changes in the brain still happen even without the trip. And so we're developing that as well for depression and other conditions as a take-home medication. And then lastly, we have a whole bunch of classic psychedelics with the trip where we've invented new forms to enable the 505(b)(2) pathway so that patients have access to affordable, cheap medications as soon as somebody else gets those psychedelics approved. So I'll give you an example. Psilocybin is in clinical studies, and when that gets approved, 5 years after the first approval, Terran has invented the world's first new form of psilocybin, a new salt in crystal form, and we're going to put that on the market in a 505(b)(2). We're prepared to do the same for LSD, for MDMA, for our form of MDMA, an antimerically pure MDMA, for methadone, for several ibogaine and DMT derivatives, and many others, including 5-methoxy-DMT, where Terran has invented either new salts, polymorphs, deuterated forms. It's where you replace a hydrogen on the molecule with a heavy hydrogen, and prodrugs. And so we've got this big program of 505b2s ready to go. And the goal of that is that we will be able to make sure patients have multiple options to break through any patent monopolies that may be set up, so that patients do not have to be overcharged for any medication if that problem should arise.
Yeah, so I have a few questions on the whole psychedelic therapeutics space, because it's very interesting, and there's we'll go into that. But before we go there, I also wanted, so I think the first product that you mentioned about when you were talking about prodrugs, that's a prodrug of a BMS drug that they acquired from Karuna Therapeutic. Is that correct? Okay,
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah, because I was reading that as you were, you mentioned about it, and I worked at BMS, so I know a little bit about the companies they've acquired and the work they've done. So I connected the dots there. In addition to, it sounds like you have an amazing pipeline of products that you're working on, and you have a good strategy as to how you want to get those therapies to market. But I also see that, you are you're also manufacturing GMP psychedelic compounds for other companies. So when did you decide that you also wanted to do this collaboration of manufacturing services for other companies? And how important is that, for the revenue of your company to fund all the other projects you're doing?
It's not that we're manufacturing for other companies. It's that we provide psychedelics to other researchers and clinics. So the issue is that, if other companies want psychedelics from us, they could also come to us. But so far, it's been clinics and researchers that have come to us. So let me kind of clarify how we got into that. So when we went into psychedelics, we wanted to do something completely different. We're not trying to be the fifth company to get psilocybin approved or something like that. We're not competing to get one of these classic psychedelics approved that other groups are doing. We don't want to be redundant. So we said, look, it's this psychedelic without the trip that is Terran's lead focus. But in doing so, we had to set up massive manufacturing, GMP, which is fit for human consumption, of LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and other psychedelics. And we do all of that in Europe right now. And once we had that set up, researchers and clinics started coming to us in Europe and other places asking for access to the psychedelics. And so we do provide, because if we're making it, we're happy to also provide it to push the field forward. But then that's when we realized that many of these, in the course of researching for our main program, many of these would be perfect for 505b2 applications on existing psychedelics. See, what we saw was something very worrying, where a lot of companies were moving to lock down exclusivity on the psychedelic space in various niches, from whether it be psilocybin, MDMA, or other aspects. So we said, well, Terran will create new forms to get around any of the IP that these other companies have set up. So we can break through their IP barriers and get cheap, affordable meds to patients, so that we don't have a situation where patients only have access to one drug, and that drug may be overpriced. And at Terran, we really just care about the patient. So in doing so, we've been able to break through the IP barriers of a number of companies. And that's what we also ended up doing when we developed Terra XT, our lead asset.
Can you share names of any companies or academic researchers that you're partnering with?
Well, it's there will be some announcements soon on groups, but I think let's see, ones that were approved to mention, at least just the name, would be University of Leiden. We're providing something there. We've been providing NRU, I believe, also some psychedelics as well. We can't comment on exactly what projects they're
Yep.
using it for, but just the name should be fine.
Okay. Okay. So,
Oh,
how have
and also in the United States, sorry, I forgot to mention
yep.
VCU as well. We've collaborated with there
Okay.
for psychedelic research.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. I'll be following your company and you on, on LinkedIn after. That's what I do with all the guests. Cause, once I talk to them, I learn so much more that it's like, I want to go down the rabbit hole and keep learning more about what you're doing. So I'll be sure
Sure.
to, stay in touch there. How have you seen the treatment of neuropsychiatric disorders evolve, like since you started the company, within your company and just in the industry as a general?
Well, we've seen more focus on neuro from
Hmm.
big pharma again, which is very encouraging because ultimately you want big pharma to invest some of the money they have back into neuroscience acquisitions and research programs. So I think there has been a focus to go back into neuro, whereas 20 years ago there was a big exit from neuroscience.
Yep.
Now we're seeing kind of a resurgence of neuro research, which is really, really encouraging for us.
And with the psychedelics, like some of the ones that you mentioned, right? So like LSD, MDMA. Now there is some stigma with using these, right? So how have you approached that in your discussions with investors or whoever you're talking to, or just the community?
So there used to be a lot of stigma around psychedelics, but I will say that in recent years, due to the groundbreaking research that a number of these universities and other companies have done in publishing the results of clinical studies, I think the public, has realized that these are very valuable medications. You
Hmm.
can just look online, and I mean, anybody has access to Google, and they can look at all of the different studies and uh, clinical trials showing psychedelics having remarkable efficacy for neuropsychiatric diseases. So we haven't really dealt with any significant stigma in psychedelics. What we have dealt with is there are still a lot of regulatory hurdles that make researching psychedelics very difficult. That was set up when psychedelics were incorrectly put on
Hmm.
Schedule One back, in the 70s and 80s, and that is a side effect of the failed war on drugs when these safe and effective psychedelics were labeled as having no medical use and a high potential for abuse. And now we're seeing that largely disproven, and that these psychedelics have shown not only medical use but remarkable efficacy beyond what our current treatments have been capable of. And so we're very excited to push forward in the research, but when a compound is placed in Schedule 1, there are a number of barriers set up that make it difficult to research in the United States. And that's why we have had to move manufacturing into Europe, as well as the creation of our new psychedelic libraries. And those were all done in the UK and in Europe. And so there's just, with the regulations and restrictions, we've had to move that work out of the US.
Okay. And you mentioned when you were talking about big pharma investing in neuro, and you've seen that trend. So, can you comment on the fundraising environment of psychedelic drug companies or bigger companies that are investing? Have you seen any trends or anything that's particularly interesting?
Yeah, so around 2020, really 2021, as we saw a large, well, 2020, 2021, and right into 2022, there was a large um, influx of capital into psychedelics. And it
Mm-hmm.
was basically a bubble. And what happened was there were a lot of investors that had made money on cannabis stocks and cannabis companies and people who had founded cannabis companies. And so they rushed into psychedelic companies, say, well, marijuana and psychedelics, we feel like those go hand in hand. And so they can't be that different, right? They
Yep.
didn't realize that uh, the biotech industry is highly regulated compared to cannabis, and getting drugs FDA approved is very, very difficult
Yep.
and requires very strict adherence to guidelines. So around that time, we were tracking 220 companies developing psychedelics
Wow.
and raising money around psychedelics, of which over 100 were doing either some form of psilocybin or LSD or MDMA and or DMT. And now most of those companies have gone out of business. And for a while, funding for psychedelics, after they hit that bubble and people realized that these companies that just raised small rounds were not going to be sustainable, there was a big drop in psychedelics funding. That didn't affect Terran because Terran didn't affect Terran in a manner, in a way that affected as much the other companies, because we also have non-psychedelic assets like Terra XT, Idazoxan XR, things like that. But now we've seen, after that kind of lull, the bubble popped, there's more funding returning to psychedelics again. But they're doing it in a more cautious manner, where investors are getting smarter about looking at whether a company really has the regulatory and manufacturing expertise. And this is very good for Terran, as we're a leader in the space of manufacturing. We understand what to do on the regulatory side and the development of new drugs. So that actually we see as a very beneficial and positive thing for the industry.
Yeah. And also, as you were mentioning earlier, it's interesting that you said 220 companies. So was that just in US or worldwide?
That would be worldwide,
Worldwide.
including
Okay.
Canadian
Okay.
companies. I mean, there's not many in Europe. It was
Yeah.
mostly most of them were US and Canada.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I've actually talked to a few friends because I work in quality and regulatory consulting space and technology consulting space. So oftentimes, I've heard from some clients in the cannabis industry or food and beverage industry and consultants who work in there, and they don't really understand yes, the regulations are somewhat similar in terms of expectation, but the scrutiny is much higher when you enter biotech and pharma, and they see it when they work with me or with my team on projects like, oh, we never did this when I was in the other role at the cannabis or food and beverage, and why are we doing all this extra work? And it's like, yeah, welcome to our life. So yeah, I've seen the same thing with consultants that I work with. You mentioned also another point that what Terran's doing is trying to break the IP barriers, or trying to uh, develop a different strategy to get the medicines to the patients, make it more sort of democratizing the access. Yes. So what are some other things that you're doing internally to also make the medicines more accessible?
By internally, do you mean
like
in
like
research,
within,
or do you?
yeah, research, and within your company, are there any particular strategies that your team has to make
Yes.
the psychedelic therapies more accessible?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one example has been through the creation of new salts and polymorphs. Those are crystal structures. And the second strategy has been through the creation of prodrugs. And let me give you two case studies
Yep.
on how we've really broken through some barriers there. Psilocybin was thought for, up until now, to only exist in one crystal form, one salt form, essentially. Essentially, it's a Zwitter ion, which is the idea that it can't really make salts.
Mhm.
And as such, there only existed three crystal forms. And since all three had been patented, the idea was that it was possible, potentially, for a company to control the entire psychedelic market, since they own the patent on all of the current crystal forms. And since the crystal forms are regulated by FDA, and you'd ultimately have a product that would have to be one of those forms. Well, we see monopolies being set up like that as very bad for the patient. And so we said at Terran, we're going to create the world's first new salt of psilocybin. When people said that's not possible. So we applied Terran's model, which is build a team of world experts around the problem. And at the end of the day, we did. We created psilocybin hydrochloride. and psilocybin adesylate, and psilocybin mesylate. These are the world's first new salts, new crystal forms. That means all the patents on original psilocybin do not block that are dependent on those original salts, do not block Terran from getting around all of that IP, shortcutting all of it for a 505b2 application with our new forms. Then we made new forms of MDMA, and we made new forms of LSD and many other psychedelics. We made prodrugs of 5-methoxy-DMT that would be orally active. So to get ready for 505b2s. And what that means, just in the most direct language, is that when any of these companies get a psychedelic approved, 5 years after that approval, Terran will be right there, ready to go with another form of the drug that can reference their data. Mm-hmm. And we'll get that on the market, and we're going to price it low. And we're going to make sure that patients have access to affordable medications quickly, so that treatment is not delayed, and that nobody has to be overcharged for psychedelics. And then that prodrug approach has also led us to some of our biggest breakthroughs to make medications accessible. For example, with TerraXT, where we feel we are shortcutting a typical life cycle management strategy to roll out improvements every 10 to 20 years. With TerraXT, we want the best forms of xanomeline and trospium that we can make to be available to patients quickly. And we plan 5 years after the first xanomeline trospium drug to be approved, hopefully this year, that we will have forms that are long acting on the market as TerraXT.
I see. Yeah, it's very interesting. Like I said, so the 5 year, that's like the patent exclusivity period. Like once that ends, then other companies can, like you are doing the 505b2. So that's what that 5 year.
It's a data exclusivity, marketing and data exclusivity period, by which then after that period, the FDA lets you use the data from the original company that got the first drug approved. Now, often those companies will have patents that block anyone from accessing the molecule, even if after the exclusivity period expires. But that's where Terran comes in, and we specialize on getting around those patents, breaking through those patents, and making sure that treatment is neither delayed nor denied to patients. The patients don't have to wait for the best forms of the drugs. The patients won't be overcharged for their medications, that there will be competition on the market brought by Terran in the form of our new innovative breakthroughs.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. So I want to talk to you about your entrepreneurial journey, right? What are some of the lessons you have learned building the company or even building yourself as a leader, working with teams? What are some lessons that you learned in your journey?
You have to be able to pivot very quickly as the science evolves, as the market conditions evolve. As basically, biotech is a game of moving very fast, and in moving quickly and adapting, we've been able. That's why we've been able to break through these IP barriers. This is something where you have to be very alert. You have to be very focused. But you have to be ready to pivot at a moment's notice. You can't just be focused on one, trajectory. You have to be constantly evolving. It's a game where when things, move and change, the pieces change very quickly. I love the quote, that no man ever steps in the same river twice, because it is not the same river, and he is not the same man. And it just illustrates how quickly things are changing, even when we don't see them change.
That's a very interesting quote. Looking at the future in the biotech industry or in the psychiatric space, is there anything that you're really excited about that you have your eyes on?
Well, I'm, hate to come back to it, but TerraXT we are very excited about, because the muscarinic system is the first new antipsychotic mechanism in 50 years. If you think about it, and this was part of why I was so frustrated back in the medical years, every single antipsychotic approved was either primarily blocking just the dopamine type 2 receptor, or it was blocking the dopamine type 2 receptor and the serotonin 2A receptor. And every variant of that was just a little change on that mechanism. It was, okay, well, we block dopamine to a little less than that other antipsychotic, or we're a partial agonist at D2-3. But there's nothing really new. The muscarinic system represents enormous wealth of new potential. This is an entire new neurotransmitter system. And it's also with idazoxan, the second drug we have up. It's in the clinic right now. It's an alpha-2 antagonist. There hasn't been a single selective alpha-2 antagonist drug approved ever in history. And so, again, we're very excited about that potential as well. And so that combined with the enthusiasm for neuroscience that we're seeing now from big pharma and investors really combines to be an optimal set of conditions that we're very excited about.
Yeah, and as so when you mentioned earlier that there were 220 companies in this space in between 2021 and 2022, so as some of those companies are observing your journey and Terran's journey, and also just the general approval strategies from the agency on psychedelic drugs and this sector, how do you think your success is going to help those companies develop a similar strategy? Is it going to open more doors for other companies? What do you think is going to happen with all the success that you're having to the overall sector?
Well, I think in terms of breaking down regulatory barriers, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so I think that anytime a company gets a psychedelic approved, and then that results in a rescheduling of the drug, we move the field forward. Anytime a new neuroscience mechanism is approved, the field moves forward. And so I think that provides a playbook for other companies to follow. It provides proof that these are fundable assets, they're effective, they can be used to treat diseases. And so I think all of that can be helpful to other companies following in the space.
Yeah, and you've shared a couple of great quotes. So I'm going to ask you one more question because I think maybe you might have one more quote in your bag. But before we wrap up, what's one key piece of advice or mantra or something that guides all the work you do?
Well, this is not so much a quote, but it's a focus on the patients. And, a number of, sometimes you talk to other companies and it's really, about, the key stakeholder being the investor, or the key stakeholder, being another, like a venture capital group. But in this case, our number one key stakeholder focus is the patient. And that is what enables us to stay focused and motivated on breaking through these other IP barriers set up by other companies, as well as our other lead assets. And so in that sense, we believe that we need to move very quickly to bring these new medications to patients, these prodrugs with potentially improved pharmacokinetics. Because the issue we see at hand is that if we don't, patients will be waiting many, many years for old patents to expire before they're able to access potentially better forms. We've seen in big pharma the delay of bringing better forms to the market until an old patent expires. And in this sense, we feel that treatment delayed is treatment denied. And so we focus on moving quickly to get these treatments to the patients, because lives are at stake and people are dying every day. And so that's what keeps us motivated at Terran.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And like you said, the drug development process, the regulatory hurdles, it's really tiring for any biopharma company. So having a team like you mentioned, that you've intentionally built a team that's agile, that can pivot, that can do things at a really fast pace. So that's really a really big advantage, I think, for any company, not just a biotech, but even tech. Or the world is changing really fast, and if you have a group of people that can keep up with that pace and then also stay on track with the mission, I think that's like the best thing you can ask for, from your team.
That's right.
So you've mentioned that there's going to be some announcements. You mentioned that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with the pipeline at Terran. So where can listeners learn more about you or more about Terran to keep up with all these upcoming developments?
Sure. So you can follow us on LinkedIn, Terran Biosciences. I'm also on LinkedIn. We also put our announcements out on X, Terran Bio, and my X is at Neon Neurons. So those are all great places, and our website. We also have our press releases and announcements on the website, and we have a dedicated website for TerraXT, which is at terraxt.com.
Okay, interesting. Any final words before we wrap this up? I really enjoyed learning more about you and everything you're doing in this psychedelic therapeutic space.
Well, I'm just very happy to be on here and tell you about the work we're doing and the breakthroughs, and that we are excited to validate the model that we set out to do to move very quickly to bring treatments for patients. And wherever IP barriers are set up that could inhibit or delay the pace of research, we will be there ready to go with our new forms of the drug and to break through those barriers. We move very quickly, and we're excited not just to break through barriers in psychedelics and in the xanomeline space, but we're working on several others right now.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, Sam. Appreciate everything you've shared, and wish you all the best with everything going on with your team and all the developments and everything you're doing to bring these medicines for the patient. So thank you.
Thank you.